The Spinoff Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Kia ora tātou and welcome to the very first edition of Gone By Lunchtime, the Spinoff Politics podcast. We are coming to you direct from the Spinoff Pod Hub, high up in the internet clouds somewhere above Britomart in Auckland City. My name is Toby Manhire and this is the first of what I hope will become a monthly podcast on all things political. I'm very happy to be joined for our first instalment by the box office pairing of Annabelle Lee and Ben Thomas to discuss, among other things, the kerfuffle around John Key attending Waitangi commemorations, the TPP squabble, and the Carnival of State of the Nation speeches from the main party leaders. Annabelle Lee is a journalist and commentator and was executive producer of Māori TV's Native Affairs when that show was in its prime. How are you, Annabelle? I'm sorry I persuaded you to come in to take part with the offer of some home baking, but owing to a burst pipe, that wasn't possible. We have some Afghans out of a packet here.
Beautiful. Thank you for the Afghans. If you'd said I had to walk up 3 stories to get here, though, I probably wouldn't have come, to be honest with you. Piece of information.
How have you been? What have you been up to lately?
Very well. Nothing much. I've been at home with my new daughter. She's 3 months old, and just setting up our new program, which is being produced by Great Southern Television, called The Hui, which will soon appear on TV3 on Sunday mornings, starting April 3.
And is that getting the old team back together? Because Mihi Forbes is there.
Yes, Mihi Ngārangi Forbes is joining us, and Adrian Stevenon, who was the Native Affairs Associate Producer, so yeah.
That will be very good. Maybe you should do something on Kohanga Reo. That would be interesting.
Well, that sounds like a good idea, Toby. We might do that. Thank you. Thanks for the
Also
tickle.
with us is Ben Thomas, who previously worked for Senior National Minister Chris Finlayson, then fled overseas, I think, and has now returned to work for PR man Matthew Hooton, which means he swapped working for someone who speaks mostly in Latin for working for someone who speaks mostly in furious diatribes. Is that about accurate, Ben?
Highly unfair. I'll be mounting a spirited defence of Matthew on my first column for public address.
I look forward to that. The obvious starting point really is Waitangi, John Key, the TPP. It's all kind of came together in a big ball of tangled up dust. There was a lot of toing and froing about whether the Prime Minister would be invited by Ngāpuhi onto Te Ati Marae. He was blocked, then he was invited. He wasn't going to be allowed to speak. Annabelle, how do you see this all playing out? Is it the same as we've seen in previous years, or is there something different this time round?
Well, it's an interesting one because it's actually polarising Te Ao Māori. You can, some are saying, he should be banned like Kingi Taurua, who's a very well-known Ngāpuhi leader and sort of instigated this whole debate about whether or not Key should be allowed on. And then, of course, the other camp are saying, of course, he should come, and the marae is the perfect place to be debating these ideas and to be able to confront him and challenge him on his support for TPP. I understand that earlier this week there was a hui of the various different hapu from Ngāpuhi. The majority voted to ban him from the marae. A few hours later, the trust that actually runs the marae got together and decided to overturn the decision of the hui. So it's an issue that's definitely polarising within Te Ao Māori, and there's nothing new about that.
Do you think that John Key is going to end up speaking on the marae, Ben?
So what he said after the week of back and forth is that he'll go to the marae if he's invited, but he won't force his way in. Talking about safety of staff, and this is business as usual at TT. The first time I went to Waitangi as part of the Crown Party, I think we left after about 10 minutes into the Pauwhiri. There's always a certain level of fractiousness, dissent, protest, and you adjust to the circumstances. You don't want to sort of be too dismissive of the day and the day before Waitangi and its significance, being welcomed onto the lower marae, but at the same time it is a bit of a media set piece for whatever the protest du jour is. It really is. It's a bit like Jarhead's depiction of war. Prior to the Prime Minister arriving, protesters are standing on one side of the marae gate, the Crown Party will stand on the other side, media are across the road, everyone's just having a cigarette, kind of chatting, waiting. The Prime Minister will pull up as soon as he gets out of the car, cameras go on, protesters start jostling, shouting, holding up placards. The Crown Party sort of forces its way in, amidst a great rancour, and then, at some point during the Pauwhiri, they'll be rushed out. And at that point, the cameras turn off, they've got their footage, and everyone goes back to enjoying the weekend.
It's going to be a big one, I think. It's being predicted by, people in the north that this will probably be the biggest protest that we've seen at Waitangi in quite a long time. Māori get very passionate about these, issues that impact on our constitutional rights. So there will definitely be argy-bargy, and I think the Prime Minister would be wise not to underestimate the strength of feeling up there.
There was an offer that was made this morning, and we're speaking on Wednesday evening now, by Honia Harawira, saying that rather than speaking on the marae, he should come and speak at the political forum. But that sounded to my ears a bit like an ambush offer, because it was he could come and speak on very specific terms, as required. You can sort of imagine kind of saying, okay, you now have 2 minutes to speak, Prime Minister.
Everyone gets equal time. Then we're hearing from Jane Kelsey, Carwyn Jones.
I mean, do you think that he will speak on the marae? Do you have a sense of that?
I think he'll definitely speak on the marae. My understanding is that he'd been instructed not to discuss the TPP. The political forum is something that happens up there every year, and it's actually a really interesting forum. And Ben was talking before about the whole media circus that is Waitangi, but there's actually a lot of really constructive, interesting things that happen up there too. So I would strongly encourage the PM to go and address the political forum.
Well, certainly the agenda has been set, hasn't it, by the very fact of having the signing of the TPP in Auckland on February 4, the day before February 5, which is the day before the Treaty of Waitangi anniversary, which is when he goes to the marae. I mean, that sets the tone, doesn't it? So it seems to be in some ways difficult for the Prime Minister to hold up his hands and say, we didn't ask for any of this, when clearly that was setting the tone by doing that signing.
Look, and at the same time, it's manna from heaven for people like Jane Kelsey, Carwyn Jones, who have really been agitating about this and feeding a lot of misinformation about the TPP, which is partially why I think you've got tempers running so hot. This is ideal timing for the protest groups. I think we heard today that sort of 15,000 people were expected up at Waitangi from Auckland. I think that's probably an overestimation, but I certainly think it'll be the biggest protest up there in recent times.
It's quite a provocative move, isn't it, to have this signing so close to our Waitangi Day celebrations. I agree, and it's I'm not sure if that's something that's been done on purpose or an oversight, but to me it just seems like a death wish, because it just means that Waitangi this year is going to be all on, and I don't know if that's really what the sort of images that you want on the television the year before an election.
The amount of coordination and planning needed to get that many sort of dignitaries there, and I think precludes the idea that it's just a political tactic. I don't think there's any interest that the government has in having protests on the street prior to the National Day. Look, Key undertook when he was in opposition that he would visit the Lower Marae every year, and he's stuck by that, and he's doing it again this year. And I actually see it as a very promising sign that he's so adamant about going and selling the TPP to the people of New Zealand. I think one of the real downsides, I think, sort of recently for the national government has been that Key, who's one of the best political communicators of his generation, and I'm talking in the Western world, not just in New Zealand, actually hasn't felt the need to go out and retail and convince people of what he's doing, because he's been writing
on the TPP specifically, or more generally?
In general. And I think the fact that he's really sort of resolved to go around the country to do these roadshows and to go into what really is the sort of the teeth of the storm up there, to try and show people why he's done this, and why they don't need to be alarmed.
I agree with most of that. I think it's really positive that there is a commitment to go to Waitangi and to go just about whatever may come. It's not unconditional. But at the same time, I do think it's hard to see. Although I go along with your kind of Occam's razor analysis of the timing of the signing. All the same, they knew very well when going along with the February 4th signing to hold it at Sky City as well, which is a symbol of all sorts of things. But it does seem like a bit of a fuck you.
Well, it's only provocative if you think that the TPP itself is a slap in the face for Māori, and it's not.
But Māori think that it's a slap in the face to Māori, and that's the difference.
That's right, and that's because of really quite disingenuous
a complete lack
from people
of
like Jane Kelsey. I actually think the without wanting to be rude about it, the kind of far left missed a real opportunity here, in that they agitated. They got quite a kind of mass movement going, opposing the sort of the worst possible outcomes of the TPP, disestablishing Farm Act, huge IP protections, and disregarding the treaty. Now, they actually won on all those points, and I would have thought that what you do as a responsible movement leader or public figure would be to say to the people who have been following you to this point, hey guys, we won. This is a demonstration of people power. The negotiators for New Zealand did actually need people in the streets protesting about Whāmek in order to be able to make that case convincingly to the other parties in the agreement. So this is a win for Kelsey et al., but for some reason they're determined to see it as a continuing loss and a continuing grievance. And they've stooped to pretty low levels of disinformation to actually make that case.
Regardless of whatever the detail may be, whether there are any possible wins for Māori, although I think the vast majority would say they don't, particularly when it comes to the issues around medicine and so forth. Māori have not been genuinely consultated about this issue. And the thing is, when you Pākehā guys get us to sign little treaties and contracts and stuff around February, sort of history shows that it usually doesn't work out that great for us. So of course there's a high level of suspicion, and Māori really buy into these big constitutional issues. It's something that Māori get very hot under the collar about. If there's a perceived diminishing of our constitutional rights, like the foreshore and seabed, Māori get mobilised about it. And so
but when you actually read Carwyn Jones's and Jane Kelsey's analysis of what the TPP means for Māori and why it breaches treaty principles according to them, it's actually a very thin piece of work. It's not the sort of thing that you'd expect from a couple of PhDs. It basically focuses mainly on the fact that they weren't consulted sufficiently beforehand, which again is arguable. The MFAT did a huge amount of consultation with groups like the Federation of Māori Authorities, with individual iwi. I remember an instance in Parliament last year where Meka Whaitiri, the Labour MP, who's Kahanunu, grilled my former boss, Chris Finlayson, in Parliament about why there hadn't been enough why Māori hadn't been consulted over the TPP. And he read back to her the minutes of one of the consultation meetings where in attendance was Meka Whaitiri. There seems to be a lot of sort of willful misremembering of the process that's actually gone through to this point.
But saying you've consulted with Māori because you've had a meeting or two with FOMA is a bit like saying you've consulted with New Zealanders because you've met with the Business Roundtable. I think that most Māori would feel that it's not adequate consultation. I mean, an example is in terms of the TPP pōwhiri, the government has been looking around Auckland for a mana whenua group that will perform.
They've dialed every number in the phone book.
And no one is answering except the Ngāti Whātua runanga. What's interesting about that is that both Ngāti Whātua Hapu, Ngāti Whātua o Orake and Ngāti Whātua o Kaipara have both said, no, we're not taking part in this pōwhiri, but the runanga, which is essentially its administrative body or its governance body, has said that they will tamete rangi. And Nader Glavish are rallying a group of 3 or 4. I don't know if you could really describe that as a pōwhiri, and they're going ahead. And I think Māori feel the same way about FOMA, even though FOMA knows nothing really about what's in TP. They've given it their seal of approval, and Māori are saying, hold up, that's not okay. We haven't. You don't speak on behalf of us.
And the perception seems to be that hey guys, you can't simply say, don't worry, we've got an exemption. Look, there's an exemption, and then say that covers it all, because obviously it is more complicated than that. Like, one of the arguments that I think is interesting is that it does create a chilling effect, because nation states are reluctant to use the exemptions, and so the very fact of the exemption doesn't per se, I mean, there are.
I think that's an extraordinary argument for a Victoria University law professor to advance.
Really?
Absolutely. The idea that the absence of an exemption would mean that the government was intent on screwing over Māori, and also the presence of an exemption means that they're intent on screwing over Māori, is this weird, upside down logic that just can't be sustained. Here we're asking, Jane Kelsey and Carwyn Jones are asking us to trust them not as legal experts here, but as students of human psychology. Them just making speculative guesses about how politicians might act, and I just don't understand it. So, for instance, when you think about these exclusions, or what the chilling effect might be, I actually can't think of what it might be, except say an American company starts a subsidiary, it creates a methanol factory in the Taranaki, and then the Crown wishes to nationalise that and then give it to Māori as part of a treaty settlement. Now, that doesn't sound like something that will happen. But that's the sort of thing that would kick in, the investor dispute resolution clauses, where you might have to try and rely on an exception.
I guess then it comes back to the consultation thing. I mean, that sounds quite persuasive when you explain it like that. But I mean, what I think is unreasonable is to dismiss, and this has been the case all through the process, and I speak as an absolute TPP fence-sitter. I remain ambivalent about the whole thing. I think personally, at one level, it's just crazy for us not to be in it. For a country like New Zealand not to be in a deal like that would be mad. But on the other hand, I think that the process from the start it's not just the secrecy thing, because it's kind of, oh no, we always do it in secret. It's the approach. You talked about communication before, but Tim Grosser, who, whether or not he is the kind of boy genius of international trade negotiation or not, created an atmosphere where there was a constant condescension to anyone who raised claims, and that's notwithstanding whether or not you want to sit alongside Jane Kelsey on every item of criticism.
What's been interesting for me is how rangatahi have really cottoned on to the whole TPP issue. Like, my 16-year-old seems to know an extraordinary amount of stuff about it that I have no idea about, and I think there's been some really interesting use of social media that's had really strong cut through with rangatahi Māori on this issue, which is interesting. And kind of cool too that our kids are so politicised and interested in an issue like this.
I absolutely agree. I think anything that gets up engagement, amongst young people, amongst middle-aged people, is a good thing. But what I think is that people tend to over and underestimate the threats to what they hold important. So, for instance, the TPP is currently vastly overestimated as a threat to, say, Pharmac, whereas people ignore the fact that the Labour Party, Andrew Little, started making making promises that the government would direct Pharmac to fund whatever, the melanoma wonder drug of choice that he had read a story on stuff.co.nz, almost certainly planted by a big pharma PR company. Which actually undermines the Pharmac model much more than Tim Grosser has ever done. I mean, at the risk of incurring the wrath of the New Zealand internet, St John Campbell has done more in his career to undermine Pharmac by running these sort of,
Be
victim
careful,
of the week
Ben.
stories
Don't you talk about John
people
We're
who
going to have
need
to cut this out. we can't have
Watch
people
your step,
slurring
Ben.
John Campbell.
his former role as sort of unofficial final appeals body for the Pharmac decision makers, as soon as PR companies got involved, and so I think this mistrust of Tim Grosser of the New Zealand government about what they might do is totally out of whack with what has actually happened in terms of threats to these things.
I do.
It'd just be nice if they consulted us as much about TPP as they do about the flag.
I suppose the only other thing which I'm slightly with that is that it did seem to...
You only want 42 people to turn up.
I was amazed to see that there was a petition signed by lots of people who presented at Government House calling on the Governor-General to refuse to sign any legislation, which did actually strike me as that if were that to happen, that would be a far graver constitutional crisis than could ever be affected by a document like the TPP.
What's going to be interesting about the TPP, just in terms of the Māori political world, is the knock-on effect, I think, for the Māori Party, because the Māori Party was a party founded on an issue about the diminishing of constitutional rights, and Tariana walked the floor, left Labour, turned her back and set up the party, and so Te Ururoa and Marama have been very, very quiet on this, and they risk incurring the wrath.
They've opposed, but
yes,
they've been quiet.
They're doing they're quiet, and they're like, oh look, they're not really talking to us about it. Well, we've had that whole narrative for years and years and years about being on the kids at the table, but then on this one they're saying no. Well, you kind of need to push your way to the front of the line and advocate for Māori, because this is one that could come back to haunt them, I think.
Just before we leave Waitangi Day for the moment, that we've had an absolute perennial as starting kind of earlier in the year than ever, is Waitangi Day is such a kerfuffle. Why can't we have a day more like Australia Day? So I'd be very briefly interested to hear whether either of you goes along with that. The lines in one of the pieces I read was, where are the parades? Where are the celebrations? Why can't we be more like Australia Day? Which makes me immediately think I'm answering my own question of Mitchell Pearce pissing on a sofa. But but I'd be interested to know whether either of you wants to see more kind of harbour fireworks and rah-rah.
I think people who say that have obviously never been to Waitangi, because there's all sorts of awesome, amazing, cool kaupapa that happen at Waitangi. There's the whole waka thing, there's awesome stuff with the kids, there's kapahaka, there's a political forum. It is a day of celebration and it's a day of protest, and it's great that it is both of those things, and thank God we live in a country where we can exercise our democratic right to kick up a stink and shake our Prime Minister and give him a little bit of biffo and all of that stuff. It's a wonderful thing, but I don't think we should be afraid of Waitangi protests. I think that's a sign that we're living in a healthy democratic country.
No, yeah, there seems to be a lot of policing that goes on in the commentariat and at large about, what's the proper way to respect Anzac Day, what's the proper way to celebrate Waitangi Day. And, the best thing about national days is that they give people a chance to sort of reflect on where they see themselves sitting in the country. Someone once said to me, the definition of a New Zealander is someone who takes part in the discussion about what it means to be a New Zealander. And I think sort of Waitangi Day really sums up the sort of ambiguous nature of our nationhood, but in a good way.
Well, that's good. We've solved that.
I'm up for fireworks, though, Toby, to be fair. If somebody wants to do fireworks off the Harbour Bridge, I'm up for that.
We'll text kim.com and see what we can do.
Cool.
We're going to move to talk about the State of the Nation speeches now, but before we do it, you can, if you want to get in touch with us, you can tweet us on the Spinoff TV or at the Spinoff TV. And if you have any complaints, you should text Radio Live on 3920 or News Talk ZB on 9292. Peter Dunn, the one-man United Future Party, lashed out at the farce, euphemistically and overly grandiosely referred to as State of the Nation addresses, which are, he went on, increasingly like the strutting bellowing of boxers at the weigh-in or a pre-Big Bash team rant full of ritual chest-thumping and knuckle-dragging behaviour, and which is symptomatic of loud, populist, shouting sports channel approach to politics. Leaving to one side the slightly grandiose words that he chose to denounce the State of the Nation addresses, Do people think he's got a point? It's now become a kind of yearly staple that we begin the year with State of the Nation addresses from all the main parties. Is that a helpful unveiling of the year, or is it a bit of a sideshow?
I thought they were quite good this year. I thought there was quite a lot for people to kind of get their teeth into and to think about. Obviously, you don't get that every year. Generally, they are pretty bland, and I think it's because of that whole State of the Nation kind of appellation, which is a little ridiculous. I think the Greens seem to have scaled down from the State of the Planet, which they used to deliver.
That's right. Yep.
Every
well, you've got to try and contain your project really.
Manage expectations.
Yes, that's it.
It's the funnest thing that he said in ages. I like it, and I think he's spot on. It's very American, isn't it? You can sort of see the Americanisation of New Zealand politics. It's like how we refer to our prime ministers as prime ministers elect now.
Right.
Like, we didn't used to do that back in the day, but we do now. And I think the State of the Nation stuff is just another part of that, and I have to say I found them all incredibly boring.
All of them quite boring, right?
Very boring for me.
I was interested because there was a focus on policy, and that's something that we've probably been missing in the electorate in general recently. Definitely last year, I think.
Yeah, there was a clear policy centrepiece to each of them that was signposted to the media. I mean, if you actually read the speeches, as I think most of us in the room have for our sins done, you wouldn't necessarily in all of them pick out what the main policy plank was. Maybe not in Keys, maybe not in Peters, but for National, to start off with them, John Key gave a speech, and it's always telling what their audience or context is to the Auckland Chamber of Commerce, and the main headline there was bringing forward the central rail link, along with some road money for an east-west connection in Auckland and some regional highways, so that was sort of balanced out a little bit. One thing that struck me, I don't know if we want to talk about the CRL too much, but one thing that struck me, Ben, as someone who used to... Did you write speeches, I presume, from time to time?
Now and then, yeah.
One of the things that struck me is that it really wasn't... He talked about vision in the speech, and he talked about big ideas and sort of insisted that they were still as full of ideas as ever. I think he said 8 years in, my ministers are as full of ideas as they ever were, which sounded a bit protesting too much from me. But on the kind of, is it only media really that want charisma and kind of, ideological vision or whatever? Because he doesn't deliver that, and no one minds really.
John Key is the boss who brings 30 cans of Lion Red on a Friday afternoon to the building site. And I mean that in the best possible way.
Yeah.
His persona is not larger than life. You can't imagine him saying the sorts of things that Peter Dunn will sort of puff up and come out with. But surely people have written those into speeches before, and he's probably ruled them out because he wouldn't talk like that. Do you think? Well, he's had a very close team since he entered politics,
sure.
And they're people who know him very well and know how he speaks. Getting the voice of the person that you're working for is very important, and his team are very good at that. It would just sound strange if he, and different political cultures have different approaches to this, but in New Zealand, you don't really ever see that. Helen Clark wasn't a big sort of picture painter either.
David Cunliffe did his best.
And well, yeah, and I think that's sort of that kind of shows where that sort of gets you in New Zealand, I think.
How did the Key speech work for you, Annabelle?
Oh, I have to be honest, I found it incredibly boring, and it just felt like one big roadmap of New Zealand. We're going to build a road here, we're going to build a road there, another road there, going to fix SIFs and then build another road here and there and there. I found it, I'd be surprised if it resonated with a lot of New Zealanders unless they work for Transit New Zealand or they really care about the local bridge, which to be fair many do. But yeah, to me it didn't seem like there was a whole lot in it that would really turn people on.
Except that I always kind of I don't have to drive very often at rush hour, but when I do, and I find myself in one of those kind of unending bloody gridlock roads in Auckland, I think this is what lots of actual real hard-working Aucklanders do every day. And all the time they're sitting there thinking, fucking hell, and so a policy that is going to improve transport in the city,
it was quite Auckland-centric in that regard, wasn't it?
Winston called it a State of Auckland speech, not a State of the Nation speech.
Just in terms of...
Continuing to push for the provinces.
That's the man.
Yeah.
Just in terms of Key, I think that's been his, one of the things that people have really loved about him is that he is the polar opposite of Helen Clark. Like, if you'd ask Helen Clark a question about anything, it didn't matter how random or niche the issue might be, she would know every little thing, every little detail about it, and she could bore you to death for 10 minutes sort of going through it all, whereas Key's got that whole, I don't know, I haven't looked at that yet, I'll get my people to check it out and get back to you kind of thing, and that has really resonated with New Zealanders. It's like they think if he's not too worried about it, we don't need to be either, and I think it's worked for him.
I sort of think one of his great tricks is that it's almost like there's a silent come on, be reasonable before everything. This is moving away from the speeches more to answering questions before every answer, and I think that is sort of it's people hear that.
The Prime Minister is the great reassurer. His role is to, I think you're right. He makes people feel better about how things are going. And sometimes I think that can lapse into a certain lassitude and a certain sloppiness if it's things that he doesn't want to discuss, say like the Inspector General's report about the SIS, after the last election. But I think that's...
And then the man who wants to replace him, Andrew Little, went into his speech, which was on Sunday, was it? Which was a picnic, which is normally the Greens approach, having a picnic. This time he was having a picnic in Albert Park in Auckland, and he went in sort of under a little bit of a cloud with the internal squabbling about the TPP and David Shearer speaking out of turn, but Phil Goff had got this kind of get out of jail free card because he wants to be Auckland mayor. But he did, in the speech, at the very least, manage to change the subject and get lots of attention with which was a pretty big, noticeable policy, which seemed like a kind of echo of the 2005 Labour last-minute interest off student loans that Grant Robertson designed for Helen Clark.
I think that's a misapprehension that a number of commentators have made, but I don't think it will have the same impact at all.
But I think that was I would guess that was the inspiration for it.
Yeah, but I think they misinterpreted what it was meant to be tied into this future of work project.
Yes.
So it's meant to be about smoothing out those difficult periods when there's technological disruption, changes in society.
Well, I think they tried to tie it into that. I don't think it actually emerged out of that. Do you?
Well we can't look. If it probably sprung fully formed from the mind of the Future of Work spokesperson Grant Robertson, who also came up with the interest-free student loans policy. Yeah. But as a political and electoral tool, it's much blunter and won't work as well, because it only targets those who are yet to do tertiary education, most of whom are not voting age and won't be voting age until the policy is in place. Whereas the beauty of the student loans scheme was that people who had finished their study 1 year previously thought, I need to vote for this. They went to the calculator, they worked out the tens of thousands of dollars they would save as a lump sum as a present from Helen Clark.
Moreover, they'd seen their student loan creeping up. I remember seeing that.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a terrible thing to watch when you've never encountered that before in your life.
Yeah, whereas this one I think actually alienates rather than co-opts those former students.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see. But it also, but parents is a big thing too. I mean, I've got a 6-year-old. You've got a 6-year-old, Annabelle, and I think they're the ones that are going to get the full. To repeat a joke, it's like, what do we want? Free education. When do we want it? In about 10 years. But I mean, how did you receive it? How did your 16-year-old receive it? Did
I haven't actually talked about it with my 16-year-old. I was excited because I had a huge student loan myself, and before Labour brought in that policy, you just watch the interest creeping up, and if my kids can avoid getting caught in that trap, I think it's a good thing. My understanding is that it was a mana internet policy, wasn't it?
That's
Lila
what
Harry's
Stephen Joyce
claiming
said.
credit for
and
it.
Lila Harry did too. Yeah. Lila Harry and Stephen Joyce joined as ever. the hip.
I'm a sucker for free education. I think it's a good thing. I think it was, people are talking about it. It's got traction. It's sort of, like you say, distracted from some of Labour's internal bitching, which is helpful. But then I saw Little get interviewed on the Paul Henry show, and it just felt like he snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. He got really caught in the whole, it's about this tidal wave of change that's coming, and we've got it, and he just repeated that over and over, and Henry
he struggled
was really,
to join the dots.
He really did, and Henry was able to. He was able to sort of get him right in the corner about it and say, well, what about these people that I've already paid for their education? What are you doing for them? And he's like, well, this is just the start. We've got more coming.
Yeah.
So I feel like it was a good policy, but the his follow up around it. What was weak, and now it's got people sort of questioning, well, can we afford this, and so on and so forth. So sort of slipped a bit afterwards. I
think you can tie it back to the TPP divisions in Labour, which is that I think it shows that Little doesn't have confidence to bring the left of his caucus with him. So if you don't look at it as an attempt to win votes, because for the reasons I've said previously, I don't think it will be a big vote getter. If you look at it as a way to signal to Greens supporters who used to be with Labour that this is a left-wing party, then it actually makes a lot more sense. If you see it as them shoring up their boundary against the Greens on the left, rather than making a play for the middle and national voters.
It's also, it's interesting that Phil Goff, who was explicitly mentioned at the top of the speech, was the man who I remember when I was at university who was the devil. He was the man who introduced tuition fees.
Right.
So I sort of thought, does he get an exemption on this too, like he does on the TPP? It is kind of symbolically not the first. It's there have been various, but it's more kind of repudiation of the fourth Labour government that continues, and you could make an argument, which is it's too long and tedious to make, but you could linking it to a broader. Jeremy Corbyn, the leftward movement of the Labour Party, which will appeal to some, and obviously is going to alienate others, like Phil Goff. I don't know about where David Shearer is on this one, but there's obviously a group within caucus who will be concerned about this.
I think that's right. I think that you can draw parallels with the Labour Party where it is right now, and the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn, and it's not necessarily the nature of the leaders, but it's how they were installed, which is by union activists, by former sort of left-wing apostates who have come back, cloth caps in hand, ready to reclaim their party, who all have extremely good skills in organisation. But what you see in UK Labour and New Zealand Labour is that those skills have been turned inwards. They're very inwardly focused organisations right now. They're basically fighting over, it might be unkind to say the carcass of these social democratic parties, but they're certainly a bit like vulture funds swooping down on distressed assets, where the carve up of the assets is actually more important than what you're doing going forward.
Certainly, I think there's some truth in that. I think that the kind of divisions and the ugliness that's in some internal parts of the Labour Party in Britain is well, it may not be all peace and harmony in the New Zealand Labour here. By contrast, it is very adhesive and stuck together. Anyway, let's talk about the Greens, who you mentioned. They went to the National Library this year, and it was Metiria Ture, not James Shaw, the other co-leader, who was continuing, I guess, project serious, project take us seriously, project we're a party of government, and she was quite explicit about that. She, almost kind of, I guess, disowned the tag of radical, which I imagine there are a lot of Green Party members who may take exception to that. The argument was that our ideas are dismissed as radical, but actually look a few years down the road and you'll see all the mainstream parties picking them up. And there's a fair bit of truth in that. Yeah. There are also some exceptions to that, and some policies that have been less heavily emphasised. But the main policy plank, or the centrepiece, was this Treasury costing unit, which was a good kind of, I guess, encapsulation of that shift, which was as if to encourage, she was going to encourage all the other parties to agree with their idea to have an independent costing unit within the Treasury that would cost parties manifestos and their policy promises, so that everyone had an independent idea of that. Do you reckon that had John Key, by the way, poo-pooed that almost immediately? But do you reckon that was an effective approach from the Greens, Annabelle?
I think it's a great idea, but I don't think it's going to win them any votes, simply. I thought it was interesting that she drew on the whole Michael Joseph Savage story, and like you said, you know, our ideas may seem radical, but, you know, a couple of years later people are pinching them, and then everybody accepts that, you know, they're great ideas after all, and you need to trust us to bring these things to fruition, because at the moment you're just getting the diluted version of them, because, you know, governments are cherry picking what they want. And I think, you know, that was a very smart argument to run, but in terms of the costing unit, even though I think it's a good idea, I don't think it's the sort of thing that's going to have people you know,
joining up to the Green Party.
Although interestingly, we see, you know, election after election, the Green Party is making major inroads in the Māori electorates.
Right.
So they're doing something right.
How did it wash for you, Ben? Do you reckon the Treasury thing was a goer?
The goal was just to establish them as serious-minded in the minds of the media, right? So the government does actually get quite an easy run in terms of dismissing the costliness of opposition promises, while by definition anything they do is affordable because it's happened, right? And whereas, you know, if Labour float an idea or the Greens float an idea, we say, oh, $1.2 billion for free tertiary education for 3 years. Well, the country can't afford that. The country, of course, can afford that. It's all about prioritisation and, you know, being willing to go into a little more debt. But you know, when these stories get reported, they're sort of, you know, government claims that it's unaffordable, that kind of thing. And so in that sense, if just to plant in the minds of the people running these stories that actually there's nothing more incredible, you know, there's nothing more fantastical about offering 3 years of free tertiary education than there is about making the 2009 tax cuts, even if one is going to be more popular than the other, and, you know, the electorate will obviously decide which one it wants or whether it's desirable. But, you know, we're not talking sort of unicorns and griffins and chimeras here. And
then, of course, last but not least, Winston Peters stood up at the Rotary Club of Orewa almost exactly 12 years to the day since Don Brash stood up before the Rotary Club in Orewa, and Don Brash was in the audience this time too. I was sort of across my maybe what if he were to succeed Winston as leader? That would be a new record probably in the Western world, wouldn't it? Having three different parties. Anyway, and he gave a speech that had echoes of that famous Brash speech, and he talked about one law for all, and it was. And he gave a general kind of wide-ranging speech about the kind of demons at the door that were going to attack our sovereignty, which included TPP and the new flag and immigration and foreign ownership. And then he went for the Māori Party, and he said that the concessions on the RMA were more of the separatism, carry on, terrible, 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 one law for all. Was that just what we'd expect from Winston, Annabelle?
Oh, I am disappointed. I expect more from Winston because he's capable of more, but to me this felt like embarrassing dad dance moves. Like your dad, you take him to a social, he's got two moves. In Winston's case it's beating up Asians or beating up Māori. In this case he's chosen to beat up Māori in a very provocative way, you know, at the Orewa Rotary Club. I just think this is a guy who managed to steal Northland back from under National. He's capable of so much more, and I just thought, how boring.
Ben?
Yeah, well, that's right. I think I take issue on Winston Peters' behalf that, you know, you would suggest he was copying Don Brash. You know, he would say he was on the treaty
he was Don Brash before Don Brash
a long time ago.
That's right. Back in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Before
He was the Pixies, you know.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting is that he's honed in on this particular treaty clause, as you might describe it in the proposed RMA changes, which give councils certain responsibilities to set out how they will interact with Māori in terms of resource consenting, planning, that kind of thing. This is very sensible from the government. There used to be a lot of flack, probably around when Winston started this, about treaty clauses, because everyone, political nerds remember and lawyers remember the treaty clause in the State and Enterprises legislation, which was incredibly vaguely worded. It just said nothing in this act shall be inconsistent with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. The courts picked that up and ran with it and started expounding on what those principles were, and there has been uncertainty as a result since then. So right-wing parties will tend to say we want to get rid of treaty clauses, it's just mischief-making from the judiciary, that kind of thing. So what you've seen in recent years is that this government in particular will put actual content in its treaty clauses. The way that they respect the way that they give expression to the treaty partnership is actually in that legislation, is actually set out in that legislation, rather than just left in there as a kind of wild card to let Sean Elias and the Supreme Court decide how that's going to be. And that's actually how the treaty partnership should work. It's a relationship between the Crown and Māori, and they should negotiate that between themselves. It shouldn't actually be up to lawyers, and in particular sort of unbearable kind of Pākehā law grads involved in social justice groups who hope to one day sort of reshape the country in their own image by being judges. The treaty itself is a political compact, and this should be handled in a political fashion.
It's a smart thing to do as you move into the post-settlement era too. Of course you should be consulting with iwi and trying to get them on board as you're going through the RMA process, and getting them, to be investing themselves in these projects and not holding them up. So it's a smart thing, I think, that it's included. And you kind of have to as you move into post-settlement eras, and Māori, become stronger and stronger players in the economy, especially in provincial places. But, consulting with people that have a vested interest isn't that big a deal. It happens in terms of farmers and agricultural stuff all the time, but for some reason when you mention, the word Māori, people suddenly get all whipped up about it.
And according to Nick Smith, the Environment Minister, it was all in the bill before any concessions were agreed with the Māori Party anyway, so it was a bit of a false target. Thank you for joining us on the first outing of Gone By Lunchtime, the Spinoff Politics podcast. I'm not sure we'll keep that name. Let us know what you think by emailing us or texting Radio Live. Many thanks to Annabelle Lee and Ben Thomas, far and away the most brilliant guests in the history of the Spinoff Politics podcast.
Kia ora.
Thanks also to producer Jose Barbosa, or as my mother likes to call him, Hosea Barbados, that nice one off the media show. And most importantly, thanks to you, dear listener. This has been Gone By Lunchtime. Talk to you in a month. I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards the
most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on the Spinoff or wherever you get your podcasts.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spinoff Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.